After being excluded from family reunions for 10 years, they suddenly showed up at my luxurious. It was one of those crisp, quiet Sunday mornings where the air smells like pine mulch and expensive lawn services. My coffee was still warm in my hands, and I had one of those rare moments where everything felt settled, peaceful. The kind of morning where the biggest task on your list is deciding which overpriced candle to light. That's where I was. Content, finally, after years of chaos. Then the doorbell rang. I didn't even flinch. Just stood there for a moment, staring toward the foyer like I could while the visitor away. I live in Westlake Estates, the kind of neighborhood with gates, cameras, and enough HOA rules to make breathing feel like a violation. Nobody shows up unannounced. So I checked the security cam on my phone, and what I saw made me stop breathing for a second. There they were. All of them. My grandmother, gray curls tucked under one of her floral church hats. My aunts, Angela with her leopard print scarf and fake warmth. Denise clutching a casserole dish like it was a peace offering. Cousins I hadn't spoken to since Facebook was still cool. And Marcus, my brother, the golden boy. He stood in front of them like the ringleader, arms crossed, a rehearsed smile on his face. The same smile he used to charm everyone out of holding him accountable. I hadn't spoken to any of them in 10 years. I opened the door, not because I wanted to, but because I could. Because they didn't scare me anymore. Because the last time they saw me, I was living out of my car in a Walmart parking lot with a broken spirit and a maxed-out credit card. But now I was standing barefoot in the marble entryway of a 5-bedroom mansion I redesigned myself. Every surface, every fixture, every shadow was something I'd earned, built with my own damn hands. They didn't know this Miranda. "Hi, sweetheart," Grandma said, her voice syrupy and strained. We were just in the neighborhood. Right. In a gated community 45 minutes from where any of them lived. With a casserole. I didn't smile. Just stood aside and said, "Come in. Shoes off." They shuffled in like a parade of ghosts. I could feel the weight of the past on every one of their shoulders. I led them to the sitting room, the one with the sunken couch and the towering stone fireplace. They looked around like they'd stepped into a catalog. Which, honestly, they had. This house had been featured in a local magazine last year. Westlake Living, or something equally pretentious. They didn't mention that part, of course, but I could see it in their eyes. Recognition. Envy. Marcus was the last to walk in, hands in his pockets, trying to pretend this was casual. He looked older, finally. Less polished than I remembered, which surprised me. Or maybe I just didn't care anymore. "So," I said, folding my arms. "What's going on?" There was a pause. The kind that tries to disguise itself as polite. Angela spoke first. "We've all missed you." That hit me like a cold slap wrapped in velvet. I tilted my head and gave a little shrug. "Haven't missed you." They didn't expect that. "Good." Grandma cleared her throat. "We just wanted to reconnect, Miranda. Life's too short." I looked straight at Marcus. Life was short 10 years ago when you all watched me get thrown out of the family house with $27 in my account and a duffel bag. "Miranda, that's not fair." Denise cut in, voice trembling just enough to sound sincere. "We didn't know how bad it was." "You knew exactly how bad it was," I said. "You just didn't care." Marcus finally spoke. "Look, I know I messed up." He always started like that. He knew. He was aware. He accepted, but never changed. "Messed up is cheating someone out of the last slice of pie," I said, my voice low and steady. "Not standing by while your sister is homeless, while everyone whispers that she's unstable because she dared to call out your golden boy lies." Angela sat down on the edge of the couch, still clutching her purse like I might take it from her. "Marcus is different now. We're all trying to be." "Oh," I said, "now we're trying." The tension sat in the air like a second chandelier. I let it hang there, watched them squirm. Part of me, a very old and tired part, wanted to scream, to throw every memory at their feet like broken glass. But another part of me, maybe the part that had learned the art of silence, just stood there, tall, comfortable in her own home. "So," I said finally, "why are you really here?" Marcus looked up, jaw tight, and I saw it then. Desperation. Fear. The kind you can't dress up with apologies. "My business failed," he said, eyes meeting mine. "We're losing the house. Mom's sick. We need help." There it was. They didn't come to reconnect. They came because I was the only one left who had anything to give. I smiled. Not a warm smile. The kind of smile you give when you're watching karma finally send the check. "That sounds hard," I said. "Truly." Angela leaned forward. "We're not asking for much. Just a place for a little while. Until things stabilize." I looked around my house. The crown moldings, the high ceilings, the life I built in their absence. I walked to the window and looked out over the garden, the fountain gurgling softly like it was trying to drown the past. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no either. I just turned and said, "You're welcome to stay for lunch. I made enough for myself, and that's about it. And then I walked out of the room, barefoot and calm. Because the thing is, when you spend 10 years rebuilding yourself brick by emotional brick, no one gets to walk in and claim ownership of the foundation. Not even blood. I was never the right kind of girl in my family. Not obedient enough, not polished enough, not interested in the things that were supposed to matter. From the moment I could string together a sentence, I asked too many questions and gave too few acceptable answers. We lived in a brick two-flat on the south side of Chicago, not poor, but the kind of family that prided itself on looking like old money without ever having any. Everything was about appearances. The clothes we wore, the people we were seen with, even the way we spoke at the dinner table. There was a script, and I learned early on that I was expected to follow it. Grandmother Eleanor sat at the top of that pyramid. If family was a religion, she was both God and Pope. Her voice was clipped and slow, every syllable chosen for effect. She hosted every holiday, every birthday that mattered, every obligation wrapped in crystal glassware and the scent of overcooked roast beef. Eleanor wore church hats even when we weren't in church. She'd walk into a room like it was a stage, and she was the only actor who remembered her lines. She never raised her voice, never had to. Her disappointment could flatten you with a glance. I learned that the hard way the day I came to Christmas dinner wearing a handmade bracelet I'd made from scraps of ribbon and wire. I was 8. I thought it was beautiful. Eleanor stared at it like it was a cockroach crawling across the lace tablecloth. How creative, she said, the word drawn out like a diagnosis. Then there was Aunt Patricia, her echo and enforcer. Patricia was the kind of woman who smelled like cold perfume and whose lips never fully smiled. She'd pull me aside after family gatherings, always with that same tight tone, asking things like, "Don't you think it's time you started brushing your hair like a lady?" Or, "Why don't you spend more time with Marcus? He could teach you a thing or two about ambition." Everything was a comparison, a measurement, and I was always found wanting. Marcus, of course, was the prototype. Clean cut, honor roll, varsity everything. My mother used to say he was born with his shirt tucked in. He never got his shoes dirty. He made adults laugh with that calculated charm that only boys like him seem to perfect by the time they're 9. When I showed my sketchbook to Grandma Eleanor, she told me it was a sweet hobby. When Marcus brought home a second-place ribbon from a science fair, it was laminated and framed by the next morning. I stopped showing people my drawings after that. I used to hide in the attic of our house, behind boxes of old coats and brittle holiday decorations. I'd spread out with my paper and charcoal pencils, smudging shadows with my fingers, sketching the faces I couldn't talk to and the rooms I didn't belong in. It was quiet up there. No lectures. No expectations. Just me and the hum of the city outside the dusty little window. That was where I felt most like myself. Not the version my mother tried to stuff into lace collars and piano lessons, but the version that didn't flinch when someone called her odd. The one who didn't want to be pretty or polite or predictable. Everything started shifting the year my father lost his job. He was an accountant at a logistics firm, the kind of steady, invisible role that made our life look fine from the outside. When the company downsized, he came home one evening with a silence that stuck to him like lint. For a while, my parents pretended everything was normal. My mother still wore her pearls to grocery shop, still sent out cards with family photos and stiff smiles. But the cracks showed. We stopped going out to dinner. My dance classes disappeared without explanation. I started hearing the word embarrassment whispered behind closed doors. The way my family handled our downer wasn't with compassion, but with retreat. The invitations to Eleanor's house grew fewer. My cousins were suddenly too busy for playdates. My father, once the calm, steady one in the room, started drinking coffee at midnight and yelling at the radio. My mother became obsessed with budgeting and posture. And through it all, Marcus never missed a beat. He joined the student council, took up tennis, applied to colleges with glossy brochures and perfect dorm furniture. He was a living alibi that everything was still fine. I, on the other hand, became a liability. My clothes didn't fit right anymore. My art supplies were cheap and messy. I asked too many questions at the dinner table, and eventually I just stopped being invited. The exile wasn't loud. It was the kind that creeps up slowly. A seat not saved. A conversation changed when you walk in. My name slowly disappearing from group messages and photo captions. By the time I was 16, it was clear to me that I'd been reassigned to some unspoken category. Not quite disowned, just dismissed. I got my first job at a framing shop downtown. I lied about my age to get it. Spent my evenings surrounded by landscapes and watercolors, gently mounting them behind glass for people who had money to burn and opinions about matte colors. I loved it. I loved the smell of wood shavings and adhesive, the quiet satisfaction of snapping a frame closed and holding it up to the light. My boss, a wiry man named Alan who wore band t-shirts under his flannels, once saw one of my sketches and asked if I had any work in galleries. I laughed like it was the funniest thing I'd ever heard, because no one had ever asked me that before. No one had ever treated my art like it was real. By the time I graduated high school, I didn't even apply to the places my family expected. I went to a small art school with a half-tuition scholarship and a beat-up laptop. My mother didn't come to visit. My grandmother sent a graduation card with my name spelled wrong and no return address. Marcus was already off at some Ivy League starter kit school, posting photos of lectures and internships on LinkedIn, and my absence from those group texts had become permanent. There was no big fallout. No screaming match. Just the slow unraveling of a thread I'd finally stopped trying to hold on to. That's the thing about quiet exile. It doesn't break you all at once. It just pulls and pulls until one day you look around and realize you're alone. Not lonely, just unclaimed. Like a coat left on the back of a chair at a party no one remembers you were at. But the truth is, I was never meant to fit in that family. I was born allergic to their way of life. And somewhere in all those attic hours and charcoal smudges, I made peace with that. Because being left out of that house meant I got to build my own. One where I didn't need to ask permission to exist. When I told them I was going to art school, the reactions ranged from polite horror to barely concealed contempt. My mother was the first to speak, calmly placing her fork down and folding her napkin like she was preparing for a negotiation. "You're too smart for that," she said, like it was a compliment. "You could still apply to Northwestern." My Aunt Patricia just sighed and looked at my father like she expected him to put a stop to it. But he didn't say anything, just took a sip of wine and avoided my eyes. The way I remember it, the silence from him stung the most. I had made up my mind months earlier. I'd spend hours in the campus library reading through old exhibition catalogs and sketching between shifts at the framing shop. I knew it wasn't practical. I knew I wouldn't have anyone to call for rent money if I ran out of cash. But I also knew that if I didn't do it then, I never would. I applied to a small program out of state. Got in. Got a partial scholarship. Took the rest on myself. The first semester nearly broke me. I worked early mornings at a bakery on Ashland, evenings waiting tables at a bar near campus, and every pocket of time in between was spent on assignments or in the studio. I slept maybe 4 hours a night if I was lucky. My fingernails were always chipped, my shoes worn down to the soles. But I didn't care. I was finally around people who spoke my language. People who didn't think making something was code for wasting your potential. We weren't glamorous or romantic. We were exhausted, underpaid, and barely getting by, but it felt real in a way nothing else ever had. I met Professor Leland during my second year. He was one of those quietly intimidating types, a guy who never raised his voice, but made you feel like every word mattered. He taught a class on materiality and contemporary forms that scared half the program into transferring majors. I loved it. Leland didn't hand out compliments, which made the ones he gave feel like gold. One day, he stopped at my workspace and studied my piece without saying anything. Just looked at it with that tired, perceptive squint he always had. Then, finally, he nodded and said, "That's a voice." Just that. That's a voice. I remember writing it down in the margin of my notebook like a prayer. He started pulling me aside after class, giving me scraps of advice, references, names. He showed my portfolio to a gallery contact without telling me. That got me into my first group show, 2 small works, tucked in the corner of a basement gallery that smelled like mildew and cheap wine. I was 21. Nothing sold, but people asked about me. People remembered my name. I walked home that night in the rain because I couldn't afford the bus, carrying my leftover artist cards in my pocket like they were business contracts. I graduated with a mountain of debt and a handful of contacts that slowly turned into clients. My pieces were modest, repurposed materials, painted wood panels, things I could source for cheap and ship myself. I showed in small spaces, mostly weekend exhibitions that barely broke even, but I was moving. That was what mattered. The work was moving. And every time I thought I'd have to quit, something pulled me back in. A collector, a mention in a local paper, a tiny grant that made the rent just manageable for another month. My family never asked. Not once. When I came home for holidays, they'd ask if I was still doing that thing, like I'd taken up magic tricks or glassblowing. They asked about the cities I'd been to like they were trying to calculate whether I was still broke. One Thanksgiving, I overheard my cousin telling someone I was kind of like a creative consultant or something. I didn't correct her. It didn't matter. The spotlight was already where it always was, on Marcus. By then, Marcus was working at a firm downtown, wearing tailored shirts and saying things like managing assets with a straight face. He'd roll in late to dinner, kiss everyone on the cheek, and drop just enough names to keep Grandma Eleanor glowing with pride. Every conversation bent toward him, like metal drawn to a magnet. He was the promise fulfilled, the blueprint realized. And I was still an unfinished thing, too abstract to measure, too strange to admire. Eventually, The invitations stopped. First, it was Easter. Then 4th of July. Then birthdays. No one said anything. They just let it fade like a polite breakup. I watched as photos were posted online of the family around long tables, smiling through another identical celebration. My name never came up. My work never came up. I could have shown at MoMA, and I doubt it would have made the group chat. The thing is, I thought it would hurt more. I thought I'd feel the way I used to feel as a kid, sitting on the stairs listening to everyone laughing in the other room. But I didn't. I was too tired to be bitter. Too focused on the next show, the next piece. I rented a studio space in a converted warehouse and painted until my hands cramped. I hung my own drywall, bought a used space heater from a guy on Craigslist, and brought in furniture piece by piece from thrift stores and sidewalk giveaways. I made it mine. It was small and a little damp in the winter, but it was mine. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was trying to win anyone over. I didn't care if they were proud of me. I wasn't building anything for them. I was building something that could hold me up. Something I didn't have to earn through silence or obedience or pretending to be someone else. I didn't need their approval anymore. I had my own foundation, and it was solid. Even when the floor creaked, even when the roof leaked, it was still mine. It was the kind of message that doesn't even try to disguise itself as anything but rejection. A single email, signed by no one in particular, sent from the shared family account my Aunt Patricia maintained like a shrine to appearances. Given the logistics this year, it would be best if you didn't attend the lake reunion. That was it. No love, no hope you understand, no signature. Just sterile text on a bright screen and the quiet thud of inevitability landing in my chest. The lake reunion had been a fixture in our family since I was old enough to remember anything. A rented house off Lake Geneva, kids running wild in the woods, adults day drunk by noon and pretending not to judge each other's marriage choices. It was the only time everyone showed up. Even my cousin Dean, who lived in Colorado and once broke his collarbone snowboarding the week before, still made it that year with a sling and a cooler full of microbrews. That trip was a constant. Until it wasn't. I called my mother after I read the message. She answered on the second ring with that hollowed-out tone I'd come to expect from her, like she was always halfway into an apology she'd never actually say out loud. I didn't even wait. "Is this a joke?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "Am I really being told not to come?" She didn't respond right away. Just a long breath, the kind that buys time. "It's not that we don't want you there," she said eventually. "It's just complicated. It always was." When I pressed her, when I asked for a real reason, she gave me some vague line about how people were stressed, how it might be better if things stayed low drama this year. As if my presence would somehow infect the weekend with discomfort. As if I hadn't spent the last 10 years being the one person in the family who never started a damn fight. I hung up before she could start suggesting maybe next year. I tried again the next day, emailed Marcus directly, texted Grandma Eleanor even though I knew she hadn't read her own messages since the Obama administration. I wrote a letter. A real letter. Handwritten. The kind that costs emotional energy to send because you know how pathetic it looks to beg for inclusion. Not a single response. Nothing. That was the year I stopped pretending there was still a place for me in that family. After that, the silence hardened. It became the rule instead of the exception. My birthday came and went with no calls, no cards, not even a social media comment. Christmas was worse. One year they sent me a fruit basket with a tag addressed to Marina. I don't know if it was a mistake or a joke. Either way, I threw the whole thing out. I kept expecting it to hit me harder, to tear something open inside me. But it didn't. Not in the way I thought it would. Loneliness is strange like that. You think it'll feel like falling through the floor, but sometimes it just settles around you like fog. Not painful exactly. Just quiet. Just there. By then, I was living in New York. A walk-up in Williamsburg with a cracked window that whistled in the winter and pipes that screamed every time the heat kicked in. I worked out of a shared studio space in Red Hook. Concrete floors, metal shelves stacked with donated supplies. One microwave that somehow always smelled like burnt popcorn and curry. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. I carved out a rhythm for myself. Mornings spent sketching or building stretchers, afternoons at my bar job in Soho, nights for painting, and watching the East River flicker with city light through the window I could barely afford to keep. I made friends. Not the loud, Instagram story kind, but the real ones. People who showed up at my shows with cheap wine and sincere questions about process. People who didn't care that my family didn't talk to me. In that world, my last name meant nothing, which made it easier to believe I was building something for myself, not to prove anything to the people who'd written me off like a failed investment. There were small wins, the kind that kept me going. A collector from Chelsea bought one of my early pieces and told me he saw something meditative but not passive in it. A gallery in Brooklyn put me in a group show alongside artists I'd followed for years. One of my pieces got picked up by a design blog, and suddenly 3 more people wanted commissions. None of this made me rich, but it made me steady. I could pay my rent, I could eat without doing mental math in the grocery line, and most importantly, I could make work without asking anyone for permission. I started saying no to people, to cheap gigs that insulted my time, to friendships that felt performative, to anyone who only wanted to show up when my name was in a headline. I stopped giving emotional oxygen to texts from my parents that said things like, "Hope you're doing well," in April, and then nothing again until December. I didn't need their permission to keep existing. I didn't need their acknowledgement to keep growing. There were days I still thought about them. Not with anger, exactly, but with a kind of detached curiosity, like looking at an old scar and trying to remember how much it used to hurt. I wonder what they told people when they asked about me. Did they say I drifted? That I was busy with art stuff? Did they lie? Or did they just erase me from the narrative entirely? I never found out. I stopped asking. Somewhere along the way, the ache dulled. I stopped thinking of home as something I had to get back to. I started thinking of it as something I could build with my own hands, one canvas at a time. At some point, the grind turned into momentum, and I didn't even notice it happening until it was already carrying me. What started as side projects and word-of-mouth referrals became full-blown commissions. Hotels asking for custom lobby installations, high-end restaurants wanting bespoke wall textures, and modular lighting that doubled as sculpture. I wasn't just painting anymore. I was designing space. I was shaping experience. And people started to care. Not in the polite, condescending way my family used to pretend to care, but in the real, budget-backed, deadline-hitting, press-capturing kind of way. It took everything. Every drop of energy I had. I burned through nights with my laptop open and blueprints spread across my kitchen table. I taught myself CAD software between projects, stayed up reworking pitch decks because a potential client wanted to see more options for dimensional contrast, whatever the hell that meant. I built mock-ups in my bathroom. I hand-delivered samples to offices I could barely afford to cab to, but I loved it. I didn't care if I slept on the studio couch for 2 days straight or if I walked into client meetings with paint on my jeans. I had found something no one could take away from me. Stephanie was the one who pushed me to scale it. She was one of those rare people who believed in you before there was anything to believe in. She worked in branding and had this sixth sense for when something was about to break open. She took one look at my studio in Brooklyn, walls covered in textured panels, a half-finished installation rigged from salvaged glass and fiber mesh, and said, "You know this isn't just art, right? This is a business." I laughed at first, but she wasn't joking. Thomas, her partner, was the grounding force. Ex-architect, spreadsheets in his veins, the kind of guy who could turn a concept into a budget line with 2 keystrokes. The 3 of us met every Friday at a coffee shop in Carroll Gardens and slowly, without fanfare, built something real. We called it Threshold, a design firm that specialized in functional art, pieces that lived in spaces, not just on walls. By the end of the first year, we had 9 clients and a 6-month waitlist. By the second, we had national press, and my inbox looked like a war zone of collaboration requests and quick coffee chats that were anything but quick. The mansion happened slowly. It wasn't a decision. It was a response. The space in Brooklyn had stopped being enough. I needed room, not just for the work, but for the quiet. I found the place on a fluke, Westlake Estates, about 40 minutes north of the city. It was gutted, neglected, and weirdly cheap for what it was. But I saw it. I saw the arches rebuilt, the tiles reimagined, the bones honored without being caged by them. I didn't hire a contractor. I was the contractor. I brought in teams when I needed muscle, but every inch of that place had my hand on it. I laid the tile in the entryway myself, designed every custom panel, every sconce. The stairwell mural took me 3 weeks and more than a dozen sleepless nights. But when I was done, it felt like the house was breathing. It became my sanctuary, the kind of space I used to see in magazines and assume belonged to people whose parents paid their rent until they were 35. But this was mine. Every arch was a rebuke to every closed door I'd ever stood behind. Every textured wall a reminder that I'd survived the years no one clapped for. I never intended to show it off. But when the firm's website launched our portfolio update, the house was in the background of a few photos. That's all it took. The messages started trickling in. At first, it was random people in the industry, design students, fellow artists, a woman from Denmark who wanted to commission an outdoor sculpture for her vineyard. Then came the ones I wasn't expecting. Cousins I hadn't heard from in years. Names I hadn't seen since family group chats were still a thing. One message came through Instagram, plain and simple. "Your house is amazing." I stared at it for a long time, longer than I should have. It was from Olivia, one of my younger cousins who used to watch me paint in the backyard when she was little, back before everything curdled. She hadn't spoken to me since I got uninvited from the lake trip. But there she was now, sliding back into the periphery with an emoji heart and a compliment like the last decade hadn't happened. And maybe that's what got me. The way they always came back when it was safe to admire me again. When there was something beautiful and polished to point at. When the mess was behind glass. When I was finally something they could explain. Something they could say they'd always supported. I didn't respond. Not because I was angry, but because I'd spent too long building something that didn't require applause. The mansion isn't a trophy. It's a fortress. And it's the first place I've ever lived that truly feels like mine. Not just because I bought it, or because I built it, but because I filled it with the version of myself they spent years pretending didn't exist. The one who didn't flinch. The one who didn't ask to be included anymore. The one they couldn't ignore. They came in waves, like they always did, polite smiles, casserole dishes, compliments that felt just a little too rehearsed. It was a Sunday morning, bright and quiet, and I had been expecting no one. Then came the doorbell, the buzz of the camera feed, and suddenly they were on my porch. Grandma Eleanor in her pearls and silk scarf, Aunt Patricia with her little dog clutched like a handbag, Uncle Robert in his too-tight blazer, and Jordan, now grown, taller than I remembered, but still wearing that look like he was about to ask for something. I let them in because I wanted to see what they'd do. I already knew why they were there. Nobody drives 45 minutes upstate just to say hello, especially not people who once acted like I was radioactive. Still, I played along, because I've gotten very good at pretending when I have to. They made their way through the house like tourists on a private tour. Patricia murmured about the ceilings. Eleanor ran her fingers across the banister like it might reveal something about my worth. Robert kept nodding at everything like he was mentally adding up the square footage and trying to guess the resale value. Only Jordan had the decency to look awkward. He trailed behind them, mumbling things about how cool the place was, how he'd seen pictures online, but it looked even better in person. He didn't know where to put his hands. I offered coffee, not because I wanted to, but because it was easier to keep the tone civil when your hands are busy. We sat in the atrium, sunlight pouring through the glass roof onto the stone floor I'd spent months laying with my own hands. It was my favorite room. Quiet, warm mine. Watching them settle into the leather chairs I'd picked out one by one from estate sales, I realized how out of place they looked here. Like they were sitting in someone else's future they never believed would arrive. The small talk didn't last long. Eleanor made a few barbed comments about how you really did all this yourself, as if there were a hidden team of contractors I wasn't acknowledging. Patricia asked about my clientele, in that tone that always meant she didn't believe a word I said. Robert went quiet, too quiet, and I could feel him lining up his pitch before he even opened his mouth. It was Jordan who cracked first. I'm applying to schools, he said, eyes flicking toward me. And, well, I've got some offers, but the tuition is, like, he trailed off, embarrassed, then added. They said you might be able to help. There it was. I nodded slowly, not responding, just letting the silence stretch. I wanted to see who would fill it next. Robert took that as his cue. You know, I've actually been working on something too, he said, leaning forward like a man who didn't realize he was already failing. Some real estate opportunities. There's this plot just outside Peoria, commercial zoning, undervalued, very promising, and with just a bit of capital infusion. I stopped listening. I didn't need to hear the rest. It was the same tone he used when I was 17, and he tried to sell me a prepaid legal service over Thanksgiving dinner. Only now, it was cloaked in family concern. We're proud of you, he said, and I wanted to laugh out loud. Proud? Where was that pride when they told me not to come to the lake? When no one showed up to my first solo exhibit, even though the gallery was less than an hour from where they lived? Where was that pride when my mother was in the hospital and I wasn't allowed in the room because Patricia told the staff I wasn't immediate family? I looked at my grandmother across the coffee table. She was sipping her tea like this was all perfectly normal, like there hadn't been a decade of silence and exile between now and the last time she pretended to care about what I was doing. I remembered calling the hospital that day, my hands shaking, and the nurse telling me that only direct family could visit. I remembered calling again, thinking it was a mistake, only to have the front desk repeat it. I remembered the voicemail I left on Patricia's phone, asking if I could just come see my mom for 5 minutes, and how that message was never returned. My mother died 3 days later. I found out through a Facebook post. And now here they were, smiling like they'd just dropped in for brunch. Now it was about helping each other, about family support, about, we always knew you'd make it. They didn't come to reconcile. They came to collect. And I wasn't playing that game anymore. I put my cup down carefully, leaned back in my chair, and looked at each of them. Patricia's tightly pursed lips, Robert's eager eyes, Eleanor's frosted detachment. Jordan looked down at the floor, already ashamed, and I couldn't tell if it was for me or for himself. I appreciate you all making the drive, I said, keeping my tone light. But I don't think I'm the person you need. Robert blinked. What do you mean? I said slowly. This house wasn't built with the idea that I'd have to buy my way back into a family that locked me out when I needed them. I built this because no one else would. Patricia started to speak, but I raised a hand. You all made it very clear where I stood, I said. You don't get to come back now and pretend it didn't happen. Not for Jordan. Not for real estate. Not for anything. The room fell silent. Jordan looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Robert's face was red. Patricia looked wounded in the way only people who've never apologized know how to look. And Eleanor. Eleanor just sat there, her cup raised, not a word. I stood up and said nothing more. They followed me to the door in a strange, stiff shuffle. I opened it, nodded, and waited. When they walked out, no one said goodbye. No one turned around. The door clicked shut behind them, and I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel triumphant either. Just clean. Like I had finally, fully, stepped outside the shadow of what they thought I'd always be. I didn't plan to say anything. Not at first. I thought I could just let them talk themselves in circles, nod politely, and show them the door like I had done the last time. But something about the way my grandmother looked around the room, like she still owned it, like she'd built it herself brick by brick instead of arriving in it years too late with nothing but judgments and a purse full of quiet demands, made something settle in me. Not anger exactly, just clarity. Like a film had lifted, and I could finally see them for what they really were. People who had spent years pretending I didn't exist until my life became too loud to ignore. They were standing in my foyer again, the same polished shoes on my tile, the same hesitant smiles cloaked in the language of family. I let them finish their pitches. The scholarships, the medical bills, the maybe we could do Thanksgiving here this year. Then I stood still in the doorway with my hands at my sides and said, "You don't get to act like this is normal." A hush followed, that soft recoil of people realizing the tone had changed. My grandmother blinked slowly, like I'd spoken a language she didn't recognize. "You sat me at the stranger's table at Marcus's wedding," I said, voice steady, each word pronounced with the kind of clarity that doesn't ask for a response. "You handed me a place card with a misspelled name and a seat next to people who didn't even know who I was. Not because there weren't other spots available. Because you wanted me to be seen and not heard. Preferably not seen either." I turned slightly toward Patricia, whose mouth tightened before I even spoke her name. "You told the hospital staff I wasn't immediate family," I said. "When my mother was dying behind a wall I wasn't allowed to walk through. You signed the form. You made that call. I stood in a hallway for 2 hours while you handed out updates like I was a neighbor who'd wandered in off the street. You never even looked at me when you said she'd passed." No one moved. Not even Jordan. Not even Marcus, who had shifted near the window like he might be looking for an exit. "I wrote letters," I continued. "I called. I asked, more times than I should have, to be included. Birthdays, reunions, holidays. You left me out on purpose and then acted like I forgot to RSVP. Ashley, the youngest of the cousins, the only one who ever bothered to look me in the eye when we passed each other in parking lots or family events, stepped forward slightly. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "We should have done more." "I should have." I nodded once, but didn't say thank you. It wasn't the moment for that. Then Marcus cleared his throat. "We didn't treat you right," he said, eyes not quite meeting mine. "We all knew it. We just didn't say anything." It didn't feel like an apology, but it also didn't feel like nothing. And then Eleanor spoke. Calm, dismissive, the same tone she'd used my entire life when she wanted to end a conversation by erasing it. "Well, that was a long time ago," she said. "Water under the bridge." I laughed. Not loud. Just enough to let the sound cut the tension that had gone too thick. I looked her straight in the eyes and said, "You don't get to rewrite history just because I have something you want now." The words hung there. Not loud. Not angry. Just true. And for the first time in my life, no one argued. No one said I was overreacting. No one told me to keep the peace. Because the peace had already been broken long ago. They just finally had to see it. I told them clearly, without raising my voice, that nothing would be given without accountability. Not a cent, not a favor, not a single inch of ground unless the people asking for it could first admit what they had done. I wasn't going to subsidize their silence or reward the years they spent pretending I didn't matter. That was the deal. I wasn't cruel about it. Just direct. And that was more than they ever gave me. Eleanor stood first. Her lips pressed together so tightly I thought for a moment she might say something cutting, but she didn't. She just looked at me like I was something foreign, something she couldn't quite file into her carefully curated memory. Patricia followed her with a tight nod and no eye contact. Robert tried to linger, tried to salvage something by dropping the word misunderstanding into the air like that would erase everything. But I didn't budge. And eventually, he left too, muttering something about the long drive and how they wouldn't impose further. When the door shut behind them, the room didn't feel lighter, exactly. Just clearer. quieter in a way that made space for what came next. Marcus stayed. So did Ashley and Bethany. There was a moment where we all just stood there, unsure of what to do now that the usual script had finally been torn up. Then Marcus asked if we could sit down. Not to strategize, not to negotiate, but to talk. Really talk. We spent the next 3 hours around my kitchen island, going over the kind of things that families like ours never touched. The assumptions, the favoritism, the silences that did more harm than words ever could. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't some magic movie montage of reconciliation. But it was honest. For the first time in years, it was honest. In the weeks after, there were texts. Some awkward, some warm. Ashley invited me to her art show. Bethany sent photos of her daughter's latest painting. Marcus, of all people, started sending me links to articles about public art and installations, asking questions that showed he was actually paying attention. Slowly, the parts of the family that were capable of growth began to inch forward. And then there was Jordan. He sent a message one night that simply said, "I didn't know how much we left you out. I want to do better." I told him that was a good start. He didn't ask for money. He asked for help. We met up for coffee a week later, and I showed him how to format a college application. He was smart, really smart, and I could tell he was still figuring himself out. He applied to schools with both music and math departments. I wrote one of his recommendation letters. By the time the holidays rolled around, I didn't send out invitations to make a point. I invited the people who had already shown up, the people who had taken time, who had apologized, who had stayed when things got uncomfortable. The table was long and filled with mismatched chairs because I ran out of matching ones. There were dishes from every background, brought by people who had become friends, partners, chosen family. Not everyone at that table shared my blood, but every seat was earned. And for the first time, the room felt full in a way that wasn't about expectation or image or obligation. It was full because we had all chosen to be there.